What if I told you that you can make your deck more fun, more competitively viable, and also less expensive, all in the same vein? Would you be willing to listen? Well, here today I have you guys a theory called the theory of one-ups, which is a very unconventional theory that many people will disagree, but there will be a few of you that will be willing to see what I have to say, and for those 3 or 4 of you, here is this lovely video. Well, the theory of one-ups was a theory that was designed by myself and fellow Mystery Machine player Elias Giannis, and together we came up with a theory that made our decks more unpredictable, more difficult to play against, and also cheaper as well. Now, I think that all three of these are very important for the success of the game. I think the game as a whole has sort of been very stagnant. And what I mean by that is most deck lists include the same cards, right? We see 3 Ash Blossom, 3 Effect Veiler, 3 Infinite Impermanence, 3 Nibiru. How often do we see that? We see that pretty often, especially at a tournament in a high competitive setting. But does every deck need to play those cards to succeed? I wouldn't think so. In fact, there are decks that do well that don't play any of those cards. So, what is the magic balance? Does it completely depend on the format? Because every format, there's usually a deck that's a combo deck, that if they do what they want, they set up 5 million negates. There's always a deck that's a control deck. I'm talking about the Floowandereezes of the world, the Thunder Dragons, the Monarchs. You know, we can go back through Yu-Gi-Oh history and find very similar decks that do different things. And I wouldn't say that one deck is more broken than the other. I think Konami pretty much keeps everything in check pretty well with the ban list every couple months, right? So we have decks that are very similar. Now, the one change that we've seen throughout Yu-Gi-Oh is the cards have gotten more broken, right? But they do it in a very convenient way where the cards get more broken on the combo side of things. So, like cards like Crystron Halqifibrax come out, or Electromite. But there are also cards like Lightning Storm that exist, and Nibiru, right? So there's both sides of it where there are more broken cards going one direction, but then there are other more broken cards going in the other direction. So it actually kind of balances out. So if we compare modern day Yu-Gi-Oh to Yu-Gi-Oh about 5 to 10 years ago, you see cards that are just better, right? There are cards that have just simply power crept other cards. I'll take the comparison of Forbidden Droplets to Forbidden Chalice. I would, of course, rather spend 1 extra card to deal with 2 threats, similar to kind of Twin Twister versus maybe Mystical Space Typhoon. There are a lot of different comparisons that you can make, or Lightning Storm compared to Raigeki or Dark Hole. Now, of course, they are different cards, but most cards, in most instances, are superior to others. Now, I'm here to tell you that the opposite is true in more instances than not, especially when we get into cards that have specific designs. And a lot of people, when they build their deck, they look at a card and they say, nah, it's not good against this deck, so I'm not going to play it. However, those same people will go to a tournament and they'll do really well only to lose to the Saki card they said not to play in round 9, right? Because someone dared to play it. And in my playing experiences, this has happened very often. I'm going to give an example of a card like Monster Reborn. Monster Reborn is a very good Yu-Gi-Oh card, but it's at 1 on the ban list, and people just have this tendency to stay away from unsearchable one-ofs. So by not including a card like Monster Reborn in your deck list, you're simply not going to draw it. But there are so many times where I Nibiru my opponent and they have that 1 extra extender. Now, maybe it's not Monster Reborn. Maybe it's another similar kind of card. Or maybe it's the Ash Blossom versus the one of Called by the Grave. The difference is those players chose to play those cards on their deck list. They made the active choice of playing a one of and agreeing to not draw it as much, but still able to see it sometimes. Now, what if we took this, right, principle, and we chose, well, let's play those one of cards. Let's play all of them. Let's play every single one of that can conceivably exist in our deck that's coherent to our strategy. So we'll play Monster Reborn, we'll play Call by the Grave, and we'll play every one of card that is good on the ban list in our deck, right? This is usually a good indicator that you're playing very powerful cards if they're limited on the ban list. But what about cards that aren't limited on the ban list? What if we played one Triple Tactics Talents in our deck? Now, Triple Tactics is at 3. It's a very recent card that came out, and you could play 3 in your deck. However, maybe it's not competitively optimal, but by including one copy of the card, your opponent at least has to think about it when they play against you, because if it's not on your deck list, then they will never know to play around it, I should say. So if we include more different cards in our deck, we can conceivably hinder our opponent in the same way as if we played 2 or 3 copies of the same card, but now all of a sudden they have to think about different ways we can execute against them. Now, there are many counterpoints to this strategy. First of all, you could say that there is definitely one card that is better than the others in more instances than not, especially if it's a 1 or 2 deck format, even if it's a 3 deck format. My counter example would be, look at every single format where a player did specifically well against the field, right? So let's look at Patrick Hoban, let's look at Billy Brake, let's look at Marcello Barbieri, all the players who dominated in the European field. All of these players were able to adapt their decks specific to the format, as well as the other row contenders, because we always go into a tournament to play against average players and not above average players. We only play above average players maybe once within the first 5 rounds, but then more than likely we're going to be playing above average players in the last 3 rounds. We have to beat the average players to play against the above average players in a regional setting or in a YCS setting. So, therefore, we should be able to prepare for everything. Now, I'm not going to say that all of these good players played the theory of one-ofs, although many of them did, whether intentional or not, most likely because these are older players, and when they first started playing and getting their accomplishments, the cards weren't as broken, so it was more conceivable to play one card over another. However, now you have so many different decks. Specific in this format, we're talking in June of 2022. There are currently 4 or 5, maybe 6 decks that you can win a tournament with. Right now, you have many different kinds of adventurer decks that are using the adventurer strategy to implement their end board, whether they go into Halqa Fibrax and end on the Scythe Lock, or if they go into the Therion combo, the Punk combo, whatever your combo you want to talk about, they were able to achieve it with the adventurer package. Then you have Floowandereeze, which is completely its own deck. It doesn't borrow any cards from any other archetypes. You have Despia, which can be played as a dish served pure or as a mixed bag. Then you have Sword Soul, and you have decks that sort of blend in, whether it's Eldritch or Altergeist, or you'll have your occasional DDD player. There's so many decks that are very prominent within the dueling scene right now. So the question is, how do you prepare your deck for all of them? Because as someone who's tried to play one card to beat every deck, it's simply not possible right now. Other than cards like Ash Blossom, which are just so generically good, even cards like Infinite Impermanence don't answer every question, every problem. In many cases, you need a combination of cards to do well. But what if I told you by playing more different cards, you give yourself a higher opportunity to obviously draw 2 different cards? If you play 3 copies of Ash Blossom, you have a higher chance of drawing 2 Ash Blossom. But you want to see that Ash Blossom more often because that's your main way of interacting with your opponent, is seeing a hand trap. But then what if you all of a sudden played a singular copy of Dark Hole? Well, now you can draw that Dark Hole against the Floowandereeze player. It could also be good against combo, but I'd much rather draw 1 Dark Hole and 1 Ash Blossom than 2 Ash Blossom. Now, maybe this is not the best example because there are certainly matchups where I'd rather have Ash Blossom than Dark Hole, where that second Ash Blossom could be Dark Hole, it could be a second Ash Blossom. So perhaps there are scenarios where you would actually want two Ash Blossoms. However, more likely than not, I would rather have two different cards, even if it sacrifices the consistency of seeing specifically Ash Blossom. Last time I checked, Ash Blossom was not an FTK. Most players are more concerned about interacting with their opponent, and Ash Blossom is just the most conventional way to achieve that. Now let's start exploring the unconventional ways of achieving interacting with your opponent. So if I'm playing against Despia, one singular Lightning Storm will not win me the game because they will always have Branded in Red set, and being able to recur their Mirror Jade along Guardian Chimera, among Ablithium, they have so many different layers of interaction that one card cannot win you the game. It's very hard. I mean, you could argue cards like Evenly Matched, but then there are ways to play around Evenly Matched, and there are other instances I'm not going to go into as well. Opening two cards is the best way to combat a deck that has many different layers of protection, specifically two different cards, right? So let's say that we have Ash Blossom from preventing them from searching, or maybe we have a card like Ghost Spell or DD Crow, which prevents them from activating that Branded in Red on our turn. So if I open those two hand traps together, then great. But it's better to draw a card that's proactive more than reactive, right? So let's talk about Floodgates. We'll talk about playing a copy of Goes and Match versus a copy of Rivalry, or two copies of one or the other. What if we played one of each? Well, Goes and Match could be good against Despia. It could be good against the Flundereeze deck. It could be good against anything Adventurer. Whereas Rivalry might be stronger against one, but not as good against the Flundereeze deck. So you see there's so many instances in where you would rather prefer one card over the other. However, we can make this generalization that we at least need to see one of them against most decks, right? There are specific instances where the exception is true. However, we're playing our deck for the majority. So the theory of one-ofs is designed to give yourself more coverage, answer problems more consistency, without sacrificing card rules. I have to stress that enough. You're not playing random cards. You're playing cards that are specific for specific scenarios that achieve the same end goal. So let's say that we want two cards to break our opponent's combo board. We can play Droplets, but we can also play Dark Hole Raigeki. Or if we want to answer back row, we could play Twin Twister, or we can play Evenly Matched Red Reboot. Red Reboot being a classic example of a card that's at one on the ban list, same with Harpy's Feather Duster. Many times people play one Duster, one Red Reboot because those cards are just so strong. But there are other people that would just rather play 3 Twin Twister because they know what they're getting with that Twin Twister. So I am here to tell you, try to challenge conventional knowledge as much as possible. I'm going to be making another video to follow up to this one, comparing the theory of one-ofs to Patrick Hoban's book, Road of the King, specifically in his thinking module section, where we're going to go through every single module of thinking and apply it to the theory of one-ofs and why it's correct in the game of Yu-Gi-Oh! So, I hope you guys will enjoy implementing this strategy in your decks from time to time. There are definitely instances where playing a 3-of is better than playing a 1-of. However, I challenge you guys to play more 1-ofs in your deck. Try to have them achieve the same end goal and watch your deck become more unpredictable, harder for your opponents to read, and most importantly, more sacky. I'll see you guys in the next video with a follow-up to this to just prove how powerful the theory of one-ofs can be. I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye.